Amid the hurricane, a lonely rancher risked his life to save the town girl he loved in his youth. Welcome back to the channel. Today, I'm bringing you an incredible story of courage and second chances set in the American Old West. You're about to witness how a lonely rancher risks everything during a devastating hurricane to save the town woman he loved in his youth, a love that time and distance never managed to erase. If you enjoy this type of content, don't forget to hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. The sun hung low over the Texas plains like a dying ember, casting long shadows across Jake Morrison's weathered ranch. At 42, Jake had spent the last 20 years building his cattle operation from nothing, working sunrise to sunset, with only his horse Thunder for company. His calloused hands, scarred from countless hours of barbed wire and branding irons, gripped the fence post he was mending. The wood was rough beneath his palms, sun-bleached and worn by decades of harsh Texas weather, but his mind wandered to the strange stillness in the air. A quiet, so profound it felt almost sacred, like the moment before a church service begins. The usual sounds of ranch life had disappeared. No cattle lowing in the distance, no hawks crying overhead, no rustle of wind through the mesquite trees that dotted his property like ancient sentinels. The cattle were restless, huddling together in the far pasture with an urgency Jake had rarely seen. Their normally scattered grazing patterns had given way to tight clusters, heads raised and ears twitching at sounds only they could hear, snorted and pawed the ground, his ears flicking nervously toward the horizon where storm clouds gathered like an approaching army. The horse's usual calm demeanor had been replaced by an agitation that made Jake's own nerves tighten. Jake had seen enough storms in his lifetime to recognize the signs, the oppressive humidity that made his shirt stick to his back despite the evening hour, the eerie yellow tinge to the sky that reminded him of old bruises, and that unsettling quiet that made his skin crawl with anticipation. The barometric pressure seemed to press down on him like a physical weight, making each breath feel labored and thick. He straightened up slowly, his back protesting after hours of bent-over work. Wiping sweat from his brow with his sleeve, he took in the landscape he'd called home for 2 decades. The ranch house, small but solid, sat in a natural depression that his father had chosen specifically for its protection from the fierce winds that could tear across the plains with destructive fury. The barn, reinforced with extra timber and iron bracing, housed his small herd during the worst weather. The wind chimes on his porch hung motionless, their silence more ominous than any sound. Those chimes had been a gift from his mother before she'd passed, and in 20 years, he'd never seen them so still. It was as if the very air was holding its breath, waiting for something momentous to begin. In the distance, he could see the town of Cedar Creek, a small settlement nestled in the valley, where the railroad brought prosperity and people from back east. Smoke rose from a dozen chimneys, and the warm glow of oil lamps began to twinkle in windows as families gathered for their evening meals. From this distance, it looked peaceful, almost idyllic. But Jake knew better than most how vulnerable the town was, sitting as it did in the natural funnel created by the surrounding hills. Jake rarely visited town anymore, not since he shook his head violently, pushing away memories that had a way of surfacing when he least expected them, like weeds breaking through carefully tended soil. 23 years had passed since he'd last spoken to Eleanor Whitman, now Eleanor Hartwell, the bank president's wife. She'd arrived in Cedar Creek as a young teacher from Boston, fresh off the train with her carpetbag and her dreams, full of refined manners and book learning that had captivated every unmarried man within 50 miles, including him. If you're already enjoying this story, before we continue, leave a like to support the channel. Back then, Jake had been a young ranch hand with more ambition than sense, working for Old Man Patterson and dreaming of owning his own spread. He'd saved every penny, sleeping in the bunkhouse and eating beans and hardtack while the other hands spent their wages on whiskey and card games in town. His courting of Eleanor had been clumsy but sincere, bringing her wildflowers he'd picked from the meadows, walking her home from church, socials under the star-filled Texas sky, stammering through conversations about books he'd never read and places he'd never seen. For 6 months, he'd believed she might choose a simple cowboy over the cultured gentleman who vied for her attention. Her laughter had been like music when he'd made some clumsy joke, and the way she'd looked at him when he'd finally worked up the courage to ask her to the harvest dance had filled him with hope he'd never experienced before or since. He'd been wrong. The memory of that conversation still had the power to cut him like a blade, even after all these years. "I appreciate your company, Mr. Morrison," she'd said after that dance, her small hand warm in his calloused one. "But I think we both know I'm not meant for ranch life." Her green eyes had been kind but firm, and he'd seen the pity there that had wounded him more than outright rejection might have. A sudden gust of wind snapped him back to the present with startling force, sending his hat tumbling across the yard like a tumbleweed. The storm was coming faster than he'd anticipated, and he could feel the temperature dropping as the front moved in. Jake hurried to secure his equipment, his movements practiced and efficient despite the growing urgency. The cattle needed to be herded into the reinforced barn his father had built to withstand the fierce Texas weather. It was backbreaking work, made more difficult by the animals' obvious distress. They fought him at every turn, their eyes rolling, white with fear, as thunder began to rumble in the distance, like the sound of approaching cavalry. As he worked, sweat mixing with the first fat raindrops that began to fall, the sky darkened to an ominous green-black that he'd seen only once before, during the tornado that had devastated the county when he was a boy. The color seemed unnatural, almost alive, pulsing with an energy that made the hair on his arms stand on end. By the time he'd finished battening down the ranch, closing shutters, and securing anything that might become a projectile in high winds, the wind was howling like a living thing. The cottonwood trees that lined the creek bent nearly to the ground, their branches whipping back and forth with a violence that made him fear for their ancient trunks. Jake stood in his doorway, one hand braced against the frame as he watched the approaching wall of wind and rain. His small ranch house was solid, built into the slight depression that offered some protection from the worst storms. The walls were thick adobe that his grandfather had made with clay from the creek bed, and the roof was reinforced with timber from the hardest oak trees he could find. He'd weathered dozens of storms in this house alone. But as lightning illuminated the churning sky in brilliant stroboscopic flashes, he couldn't shake the feeling that this storm was different, bigger, more dangerous than anything he'd seen in 2 decades of ranching. The very air seemed charged with malevolent energy, and he could feel it tingling against his skin like electricity. The radio crackled to life from the kitchen table, its normally clear signal distorted by atmospheric interference. The emergency broadcast was barely audible over the growing roar of wind. ... Major hurricane. Unprecedented for this region. ... Winds exceeding 100 miles per hour. Evacuate immediately. Seek higher ground. This is not a drill. ... Double quotes. Jake's blood ran cold as ice water. Cedar Creek sat in a low valley, directly in the storm's path. The railroad tracks that brought the town's prosperity also made it a natural funnel for floodwaters rushing down from the surrounding hills. Most of the buildings were wood-frame construction, built for convenience and economy rather than surviving a hurricane. The church, the school, the general store, all would be at the mercy of winds they were never designed to withstand. And the people, Jake thought of the families he'd known since childhood. The children who played in the streets, the elderly who might not be able to evacuate quickly enough. He thought of Eleanor, probably huddled in the bank president's fine house with its large windows and ornate trim, the house that had never been tested by a storm of this magnitude. Thunder whinnied from the barn, sensing his master's agitation through the bond they'd built over years of working together. The horse was more than just transportation. He was Jake's partner, his companion in the lonely years since he'd chosen isolation over the risk of rejection. Jake pulled on his heavy coat and hat, his mind racing through possibilities and obstacles. He could stay safe on his ranch, protected by his grandfather's wisdom and his father's preparations, or he could risk everything to warn the town and the woman he'd never stopped loving, despite 23 years of trying. The decision, when it came, surprised him with its clarity and certainty. Jake saddled Thunder with practiced efficiency, his hands steady, despite the chaos brewing, both in the sky above and in his chest. The horse danced nervously as wind and rain lashed the barn, each lightning flash casting wild shadows that made the familiar space seem alien and threatening. But Jake's calm voice, roughened by years of shouting over cattle and wind, soothed the animal as it always had. Easy, boy. We've got work to do tonight. His words were almost lost in the growing cacophony, but Thunder's ears flicked toward him, finding comfort in the familiar tone. The ride to town would normally take 20 minutes of easy riding through familiar terrain. In this storm, with flooding streams and debris turning the landscape into an obstacle course, it might take hours, if they made it at all. But as Jake swung into the saddle, feeling Thunder's powerful muscles tense beneath him, he couldn't ignore the voice in his head that had been silent for 23 years, now screaming with urgent clarity. She needs you. The storm hit them with full fury the moment they left the shelter of the barn. Rain came in horizontal sheets, stinging like buckshot against Jake's face and turning the familiar path into a treacherous river of mud and debris. Thunder picked his way carefully down the muddy slope, his hooves sliding on ground that had turned treacherous, each step a calculated risk. Lightning split the sky every few seconds, illuminating a landscape transformed into an alien hellscape of bent trees and flying debris. Jake had to lean forward in the saddle, pressing his face against Thunder's neck to shield his eyes from the driving rain. The horse's coat was already soaked through, steam rising from his heated body as he fought against the wind that seemed determined to push them back toward the safety they'd abandoned. The trail to town, usually a path through mesquite and oak, had become a rushing stream carrying branches, rocks, and debris from upstream. The sound was overwhelming, not just the wind and rain, but the ominous roar of Cedar Creek itself, swollen far beyond its banks and carrying away everything in its path. By the sound of it, the creek was already overflowing, turning the gentle waterway that gave the town its name into a raging torrent. As they struggled through the storm, memories flooded back with startling clarity, as if the extreme circumstances had stripped away the careful barriers he'd built around his heart. Eleanor's laugh, bright and musical as church bells, when he'd made some clumsy joke at a church social. The way her eyes had sparkled with what he'd mistaken for love when he'd stammered through asking her to the harvest dance. His hands shaking so badly he could barely hold his hat. "You're sweet, Jake Morrison," she'd said that night, her voice soft as silk in the lantern light of the church hall. Sweeter than any man has a right to be. But even then, even in his youthful infatuation, he'd heard the note of sadness in her voice, as if she were already saying goodbye. If you're enjoying this incredible journey, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps me out. The memory of their last conversation played in his mind as Thunder fought through knee-deep water that had never been there before. "I appreciate your company, Mr. Morrison," she'd said after that dance, her small hand warm in his calloused one. "But I think we both know I'm not meant for ranch life." She'd been wearing a blue dress that brought out the green in her eyes, and he could still remember the scent of her perfume. Something floral and expensive that spoke of a world beyond cattle and dust. She'd been right, of course. Eleanor belonged in drawing rooms and libraries, discussing literature and current events, not chasing cattle through dust and heat, or mending fences under the brutal Texas sun. When Thomas Hartwell arrived from Louis with his banking credentials and cultured manner, his fine suits and knowledge of the wider world, Jake had stepped aside without a fight. He'd told himself it was for her own good, that she deserved better than a cowboy's uncertain future. But late at night, alone in his small house with only the wind for company, he'd wondered if he'd given up too easily, if she'd wanted him to fight for her, to prove that his love was worth more than security and social standing. A massive oak, easily 3 feet in diameter and old enough to have witnessed the birth of Texas itself, crashed across the trail 50 yards ahead. Its massive trunk, twisted and splintered by the wind, blocked their path completely. Thunder reared, nearly unseating Jake, who fought to control the panicked horse while debris flew past them like artillery shells. The animal's eyes were white with terror, and Jake could feel the powerful muscles bunching beneath him as Thunder prepared to bolt. "Whoa, boy, easy." Jake's voice cut through the chaos, and gradually Thunder's panic subsided into nervous energy. They'd have to find another way around, through the flooded pastures that bordered the Hendricks place. Terrain that was treacherous, even in good weather. The detour cost them precious time, and nearly cost them their lives. The Hendricks pasture had become a lake, with only the tips of fence posts marking where solid ground had once been. Thunder had to swim in places, his powerful strokes carrying them through water that grew deeper with each passing minute. Twice, Jake thought they might be swept away by the current, but Thunder's strength and sure instincts brought them safely to higher ground. By the time they reached the outskirts of Cedar Creek, the wind was strong enough to lift a man off his feet. Jake dismounted and led Thunder by the reins, both of them leaning into the gale at impossible angles just to stay upright. The town that had seemed so peaceful from his ranch was now a war zone of flying debris and rising water. The destruction was heartbreaking. The general store's hand-painted sign, a source of pride for old Mr. Peterson, had torn free and down Main Street like a giant playing card before smashing against the church steps. Shutters hung loose and banged against buildings with sounds like gunshots. The beautiful oak trees that had lined the main street for 50 years lay uprooted, their massive root systems exposed like the ribs of some enormous beast. Most concerning of all, Jake could see the dark line of floodwater creeping up from the creek, carrying debris and moving with frightening speed. Barrels, lumber, and pieces of buildings swept past in the surge, and he could see the water level rising even as he watched. The few people still outside were struggling toward the school building on higher ground, the designated storm shelter. Their movements were desperate. Families helping elderly relatives and carrying small children as they fought against the wind and rain. Jake squinted through the driving rain, looking for Eleanor's distinctive auburn hair among the fleeing townspeople. He didn't see her anywhere, his heart pounding with a fear that had nothing to do with the storm around him. Jake tied Thunder to the strongest hitching post he could find, a thick oak post in front of the church that had stood firm for 30 years. He had to shout reassurances over the wind as he secured the reins, knowing that his faithful horse was their only hope of escape if they survived what came next. Fighting his way toward the Hotwell house was like swimming upstream against a current of wind and debris. Every step was a battle, and more than once he was nearly knocked down by flying objects, a piece of tin roofing that missed his head by inches, a wagon wheel that bounced past like a child's toy, shutters and boards and bits of people's lives torn loose and flung about by the storm's fury. The imposing two-story Hotwell house sat on what had once seemed like a fashionable lot near the creek, its gingerbread trim and large windows speaking of prosperity and refinement. Now, with water lapping at the front steps and the wind tearing at its ornate decorations like a jealous lover, it looked like a ship about to founder in a hurricane. Through a gap in the storm clouds, illuminated by a brilliant flash of lightning, Jake caught sight of a figure in one of the upstairs windows. Even at this distance, even after 23 years of separation and silence, he knew that silhouette as well as he knew his own reflection. Eleanor was trapped in the house, and the flood was rising fast. Leave your comment about what you think of this story so far. Jake fought his way to the Hotwell house as debris flew past him like bullets. A piece of tin roofing missed his head by inches, embedding itself in the wooden fence behind him. The floodwater was... Morrison, she breathed, reaching out to help pull him through the window. After all these years, no time for catching up, Jake gasped, stumbling into the room. This whole house is going to go under. Where's your husband? Thomas left for Austin yesterday on business, Eleanor said, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. The storm came up so fast, ... I thought I could wait it out, but the water... A tremendous crack from below cut her off. Through the floor, they could feel the house shudder as the flood tore at its foundations. Eleanor grabbed Jake's arm, her fingers digging into his coat. We need to get to higher ground, Jake said, looking around the room. The school building, can you make it that far? Eleanor nodded, though fear flickered in her eyes. I'm not the young woman you used to know, Jake. I'm 41 years old, and I haven't ridden a horse in 20 years. Jake thought of Thunder, probably terrified and fighting his reins in the growing flood. The horse was their only chance. But the journey to the school would be treacherous, even for an experienced rider. Another crash from below, louder this time. The house was coming apart. We'll manage, Jake said firmly. Trust me. Leave your comment about what you think of this story so far. They climbed back through the window together, Eleanor gathering her skirts and following Jake's lead with surprising agility. The descent was harder than the climb. The flood had risen another foot, and the current was stronger. Jake went first, then caught Eleanor as she lowered herself into his arms. For a moment, she was pressed against his chest, her face inches from his. 23 years melted away, and he was 22 again, young and in love and believing anything was possible. I never forgot, she whispered, just loud enough for him to hear over the storm. Before he could respond, the house gave another ominous groan. They had to move. Wading through the flood was like walking through molasses filled with battering rams. Chunks of buildings, uprooted trees, and debris of every description swept past them in the surging water. Jake kept one arm around Eleanor's waist, using his other hand to push away anything that threatened to knock them down. Thunder was still where Jake had left him, though the water now reached the horse's belly. The animal's eyes were white with panic, but he calmed at the sound of Jake's voice. Easy boy. We need you to be brave. Getting Eleanor onto Thunder's back was the hardest part. She was exhausted and soaked through, and the horse was skittish from the storm. But somehow, with Jake's boost and her own determination, she managed to swing her leg over the saddle. Jake grabbed Thunder's reins and began leading them toward higher ground. The school was only 3 blocks away, but those 3 blocks might as well have been 3 miles. Every step was a battle against the flood, the wind, and the flying debris that turned the air into a shooting gallery. Halfway there, Eleanor screamed. A massive beam from someone's barn roof was spinning toward them like a giant spear, carried by the flood and aimed directly at Thunder's head. Without thinking, Jake threw himself forward, catching the beam with both hands and deflecting it, just enough to send it crashing harmlessly into a fence post. The impact drove him to his knees in the rushing water, and for a terrifying moment, the current threatened to sweep him away. Eleanor leaned down from the saddle, grabbing his collar and hauling him back to his feet with surprising strength. "Don't you dare give up on me now, Jake Morrison," she shouted over the wind. Those words, and the fierce determination in her green eyes, gave him the strength to keep going. The school building loomed ahead like a lighthouse in the storm, its solid brick construction and elevated position making it the safest place in Cedar Creek. Jake could see other townspeople sheltering on the covered porch, their faces pale and frightened as they watched the flood consume their community. Getting Thunder up the hill to the school was the final test of their endurance. The horses' hooves slipped on the muddy slope, and twice Jake thought they might slide backward into the flood. But Thunder's strength and sure footing, combined with Jake's steady guidance, brought them safely to the shelter. Gentle hands helped Eleanor down from the saddle as Jake led Thunder to the relative safety of the school's covered walkway. The horse was exhausted but unharmed, and Jake took a moment to pat his neck gratefully. "That's the bravest horse in Texas," Eleanor said softly, appearing at Jake's shoulder with a blanket someone had given her. "And the bravest man." Jake turned to look at her properly for the first time since the rescue began, even soaked and disheveled. Even after the harrowing journey through the storm, she was still the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen. But more than that, he could see the strength in her that he'd been too young to recognize before. The same strength that had pulled him to his feet when he'd faltered in the flood. "Eleanor, he began, but was interrupted by Dr. Patterson. "Mrs. Hartwell." The town physician hurried over with his medical bag. "Are you injured? We were so worried when we couldn't find you at the shelter." "I'm fine, doctor, thanks to Mr. Morrison." Eleanor's eyes never left Jake's face. "He risked his life to save me. Climbed right up the side of our house in the middle of the hurricane." Word of the rescue spread quickly among the gathered townspeople, and soon Jake found himself overwhelmed by attention and questions from neighbors he hadn't spoken to in years. This was exactly why he'd avoided town for so long. All these people, all this noise and fuss. He started to back away, looking for escape, but Eleanor caught his hand. "Walk with me," she said quietly, "please." They found a quiet corner of the school porch, away from the crowd and the questions. The storm was finally beginning to weaken, though rain still drummed on the roof above them. "I owe you an explanation," Eleanor said, settling onto a wooden bench and patting the space beside her. "About what I said back there, in the flood." Jake sat down carefully, leaving space between them. "You don't owe me anything, Eleanor. That was a long time ago, was it?" Eleanor turned to face him, her green eyes serious. "Because it doesn't feel like a long time ago. When I saw you climbing toward my window, when you caught me as I fell, it felt like yesterday." Jake looked out at the devastated town, buying time to find the right words. "You made the right choice, Eleanor. Thomas Hartwell was the better man for you. I was just a cowboy with big dreams and empty pockets. You were the man I loved," Eleanor said simply. "The man I sent away because I was too proud and too scared to choose love over security." The words hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross. Jake felt 23 years of carefully buried hope stirring in his chest. "Thomas is a good man," Eleanor continued. "He's given me a comfortable life, and I don't regret marrying him. But comfortable isn't the same as happy, Jake. I've spent 2 decades wondering what might have been. And now?" Jake asked quietly. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, watching the flood recede and reveal the damage to their town. "Now I know that some things don't change. When I saw you in that storm, when you risked everything to save me, I knew that what I felt for you was real. Is real." Jake reached over and took her hand, marveling at how perfectly it still fit in his. "What are we going to do about it?" "I don't know," Eleanor admitted. "Thomas will be back from Austin in a few days. The town will need rebuilding. My life is complicated now in ways it wasn't when we were young. But," she smiled then, the same radiant smile that had captured his heart 23 years ago. "But I'm not going to make the same mistake twice. I'm not going to let fear choose for me again." They sat together in comfortable silence as the storm finally passed, their hands intertwined and their hearts open to possibilities they'd thought were lost forever. The town would rebuild, stronger than before. And perhaps, Jake thought, so would they. Thunder snorted softly from nearby, as if approving of this turn of events. Jake chuckled and squeezed Eleanor's hand. "What's so funny?" she asked. "I was just thinking," Jake said, "that sometimes it takes a hurricane to blow you toward where you're supposed to be." Eleanor leaned against his shoulder, feeling truly at peace for the first time in 23 years. "Sometimes," she agreed. "It does. What an incredible journey of courage and second chances." This story shows us that sometimes the biggest storms in life can lead us back to what matters most: love, sacrifice, and the bravery to face our past. These are the things that truly define us. What was your favorite part of this story? Was it Jake's dangerous climb to Eleanor's window, their struggle through the flood, or that beautiful moment of recognition at the end? Leave your comment below and let's talk about it. I love reading your thoughts and responding to your questions. If you enjoyed this tale of love and redemption in the Old West, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Ring that notification bell so you never miss our next incredible story. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.